It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. The ongoing police murders of African Americans has brought national attention to the question of racial disparities in our society. This fact was made even clearer with the release of a new Department of Justice report on the Baltimore Police Department this week. It shows that African Americans are 5 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession than whites, despite similar rates of use. And they account for 95% of people stopped by police, more than 10 times the rest of the population. But the racial disparities in our society go far beyond policing and more present in each domain of life in our society, such as schools, streets, to the workplace, and they make up significant difference in the quality of life, opportunities, and security of African Americans in the United States. To discuss the reasons for some of these disparities, we are joined by Jeannette Wicks-Lim, who recently penned an article in Dollars and Cents magazine titled, "It Pays to Be White," assessing how white people benefit from race-based economic inequality. Jeannette Wicks-Lim is an associate professor at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Jeannette, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Jeannette, if African Americans have the deck stacked against them in every major life activity, white Americans have the deck stacked in their favor. So what is it you were trying to get at in this article?
Right. Well, the goal of this piece was to draw on the wide array of research that's already available that documents racial inequality here in the U.S. And I wanted to pick examples that covered really the basic facets of our daily lives. That includes, as you mentioned in your introduction, things like how we treat our children, what we experience at the workplace, our basic economic security, and our personal freedoms. And I wanted to take these examples, try to make them really concrete, but shift the conversation somewhat by talking about these differences not as just as disadvantages that the African American community experiences. While it's important to do that, but the conversation seems not to focus as much on the flip side of this, which is that white Americans benefit from their elevated status in American society based on their racial identity. I think it's important to focus on that aspect as well. And there are basically 2 reasons why I wanted to try to shift the conversation this way. I think that we need to, if we want to really think about how to eliminate racism, we really need to be clear about what's at stake for white Americans, that they do have this race-based elevated status in the U.S., and that gives them, by virtue of their racial identity, certain privileges and advantages. And this is, again, just the flip side of what Black Americans experience. These are unearned, undeserved disadvantages for the African American community. These are unearned
privileges for the white community. So let's take a look at some of the examples that you would like to highlight.
Right. So I'll provide some examples, but I just wanted to say this is something that I heard that I think captured really well what I wanted to get across with this piece, is that unless we really are clear about the race-based advantages for white Americans, then any of the policies we try to pursue to make things more fair on the basis of race, anything we try to do to reduce racial inequality will feel oppressive to those who have that privilege, who have race-based privilege.
Right. So important point. Right.
Really see that we won't get a lot of social support for reducing racial inequality, social policies that would do this.
Right.
So the examples I came up with, so one, this is a very basic example, is about school. So it really pays to be white in school. There was a study that was done recently in 2012, I think the study came out, that looked at recently released data on local and state spending on schools. And through this report, they were able to discover what the differences were for a child going to school at a predominantly white school versus a predominantly non-white school. Now, if you're a child that goes to a predominantly white school, and that is 90% or more white, then you can expect your elementary school education to have funding that has $3 million more at its disposal than if you were a child attending an elementary school that is 90% non-white. Now, these kinds of schools are referred to as hyper-segregated schools, and they're not a small share of the schools that exist in the U.S. About 1/3 of children in the U.S. attend hyper-segregated schools. So it really pays to be white in school because you have $3 million more at your disposal to fund things like better physical facilities, more staffing, better computer equipment, and the list goes on.
And in this case, Jeannette, where is exactly the white privilege at?
Well, I think it's, for any parent who sends their kids to school to imagine that their school has $3 million more in funding to supply their child with quality education, that's an advantage, a $3 million advantage.
Right. And there you outline a broad group of life activities that make these kinds of determinations really profound in terms of white privilege. Tell us a few more of those examples.
Sure. There was a really interesting study that I read that was a study that was co-sponsored by the American Civil Liberties Union here in Massachusetts, along with the Boston Police Department. They were trying to assess the Boston Police Department's, basically the stop and frisk policy. They have a different, more official title, but that's basically the practice that they were trying to analyze. And so with this co-sponsored study, some researchers studied the practices over 2007 and 2010 of the stop and frisk practices of the Boston Police Department. And what they found was that even controlling for things like levels of crime and such, residents in predominantly white neighborhoods experience stop and frisks by the Boston Police Department markedly less than if you were a resident of a predominantly black neighborhood. So I tried to make this very clear, like the difference in magnitude. So take, for example, this is just an illustration, a 30-year-old adult, and you are a resident of a predominantly white neighborhood in Boston. You could expect to be stop and frisked maybe twice in over 10 years. And so maybe you were stopped when you're 15, maybe you were stopped when you're 25, and that was just about it. You were minimally affected by the police department's stop and frisk policy. Now, take the same 30-year-old adult, and if they were a resident of a predominantly black neighborhood, their experience would be very different. They would be stop and frisks maybe once every 3 years. So again, let's think about what that would mean. When you're 15 years old, you're stopped by the police. 18 years old, you're stopped by the police again. When you turn 21, you got stopped by the police another time. 24, one more time, 27, and then again at 30. So just your basic personal freedom to move about has been changed markedly by whether or not you are white or whether you're black. If you are a white American or if you are a resident of a predominantly white neighborhood, your ability to move about freely is markedly greater than if you are a resident of a predominantly black neighborhood.
That's rather interesting. A lot of this isn't new. We've known about this in our society for a very long time. And there's been certain periods in our time where it's been brought to the attention of policymakers and people studying these issues to do something about it. But again and again, very little is actually getting done to address the problem. So what are some of the concrete ways we can begin to correct the odds to equalize the system?
Right. So this piece, what I tried to get across is something maybe a bit more fundamental than specific concrete policies, although I can talk about those in a minute, is simply to reshape the conversation about white privilege as opposed to black disadvantage. Because until people really feel like, I mean, broadly speaking, until we really feel like there are unearned privileges in this society, people will not get behind things like redistributing resources in order to make racial inequality a reality. So, for example, policies like affirmative action policies, those get a lot of political pushback because there, I think, is a basic feeling that affirmative action is unfair because the unearned race-based privilege of being white has not been really confronted and accepted by the general American community. So things like that, things that's a proactive, something that's proactive that tries to make things more fair on the basis of race. That kind of affirmative action, those kinds of policies like affirmative action, have a hard time getting a lot of political traction because we don't recognize, broadly speaking, that there is white privilege and not just Black disadvantage. One other policy that has gotten some attention in recent months, I think because the Black Lives Movement has brought such strong attention to issues facing the African American community, is the policy of reparations. And this is something that we just don't talk much about. And the basic idea behind reparations is to first acknowledge, document what kind of racial inequality has occurred over the history of the U.S. based on our history of having slavery, and then by other race-based public policies that have existed beyond that. So first, seeing those, documenting what those meant, what are those economic ramifications, and then figuring out what do we do to repair those losses to the African American community. So that kind of a reparations policy would, I think, first get at the question of let's really be honest about what's happening here in the U.S. on the basis of race, and then what do we do to repair that?
And do you have some, besides shifting the dynamics of the conversation, are there some examples of what has worked in the past?
Yeah, that's a really hard question because I think one of the reasons why I wrote this was because I had this strong feeling, again, based on the news coverage and the attention that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to this issue, that there's some fundamental block for the American society in dealing with the issue of racism. And I was really trying to get at what is it that's blocking us from doing that. I think that, of course, we have made a lot of progress. There are policies that we've had that have made a lot of progress in getting us to a more equal footing. But even, I think this past week, there was a report that was released that said something like it would take centuries before Black American households could achieve racial wealth inequality.
Yeah, we're actually going to be doing an interview on that very report later this afternoon, but important one, yeah.
Right, so that, we have, given today's policies, it would take centuries to achieve racial parity on the basis of wealth. And so, yes, we have made some progress, but there are some fundamental things that we haven't grappled with. And I think it's this idea that we have race-based inequality that has two sides to it, white privilege and Black disadvantage. And we haven't dealt as much to think about how do we shift resources so that we eliminate the white privilege in order to eliminate Black disadvantages.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether a lot of that has to do with the redistribution of resources. Obviously, it does. Jeannette, I thank you so much for coming on and beginning this conversation about shifting the conversation to looking at white privilege, and hope to have you back because it is a great opening, and I think it's an ongoing discussion.
Right, and I just want to say that there is a bill that Congressman John Conyers has been putting out for many years, trying to just open up this conversation in a formal way in Congress. So, there are policy moves that we can make to push this in a real way.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.